Welcome to Disciple Dojo. I just want to do a quick review in this episode of a new resource that our friends over at Lexham Press sent me. After SBL this year, Lexham sent me a number of resources that I was interested in. I was like, hey, let me check these out because I think they would be interesting to a lot of you out there. And so I'll be going through some of the other ones over the coming months because they sent me a stack. But one of the ones that I want to talk about in this episode is their new Lexham Interpreter's Translation, the volume on Romans by Michael Bird. So as we jump into this, if you haven't already subscribed, it would be great if you do that. That helps this channel grow. It helps us to continue to get more reviews of resources in front of more people's eyes. It helps us to get more teaching out there, more biblical exegetical teaching, and also interviews with scholars, authors, people that I think are interesting and worth talking to. So all of that, in addition to our outreaches, our Refugee Jitsu outreach and our Grown-Ups Table and Grown-Ups Table Friends and Alumni groups where people are connecting and finding community online. All of that is under the umbrella of Disciple Dojo. And so when you subscribe to this channel and you help get word out about it, you're helping a lot more than just to make these type of videos. So with that out of the way, let's look at Michael Bird's new volume on Romans. For those of you who may not know, Michael Bird did the volume on Romans in the Story of God Bible Commentary series by Zondervan, which is an excellent series. We've had a number of the contributors to that series here on the channel. And I'd love to get Mike on the channel sometime because he's someone whose work I've used over the years. We're Facebook friends and we've had I think brief interactions on Facebook, but I don't know him. He doesn't know me. He's just someone who I know out there in the world of biblical studies. He also co-authored the New Testament in its World with that volume. So he's a prolific New Testament scholar. He's spent a lot of time in Romans, and this volume it's not just a paraphrase of Romans. It is a paraphrase. That's the first thing to make clear. This is a paraphrase of the book of Romans, but it also contains the Greek text and a fairly literal-ish translation of the Greek text, interlinear, and then translator notes that go along with it. But let me show you what it is real quick, and then you can decide if this is something you're interested in or not. So it's a small volume, less than 150 pages, and it, like it says, Greek, English, interlinear, paraphrase, and study notes. So there's some endorsements here at the front, including from my friend Nijay Gupta. And then we get into it. There's an intro that talks about the importance of reading any text afresh. The purpose is first to make the New Testament feel distant and weird via a literal and wooden translation married closely to the Greek text. So that's the first point. And then also the goal is to make the New Testament clear and relatable through a creative paraphrase. The concept of familiarity breeds contempt. We read a passage so many times that it just becomes familiar to us. And so what Bird is trying to do in this series is present it in its original reading, a woodenly literal, so you can get the idea. This was a piece of ancient Greek rhetoric that also happens to be inspired scripture, but the form in which it's given is ancient Greco-Roman rhetoric. So let's make that clear in the literal translation. Then let's restate what it's saying in a creative and a much more modernized contextual way to bring home the idea of what the passage is communicating. So you're getting both ends of the literal word for word versus figurative or thought for thought translation spectrums in one volume, in this case for the book of Romans. So he says this volume offers a literal, weirdly literal in places, translation of the New Testament to make it seem deliberately foreign and distant. In other words, to defamiliarize readers with the text. And the purpose is to draw readers away from their assumption about what the text is talking about, that tests their traditions, fractures their familiarity, and exposes the propensity to assume that their world of cultural Christianity is basically the same as the first century world. I want to show you that the New Testament might not be referring to the stuff that you always supposed it did. And then he closes it with this analogy. He says, this volume is what you might consider a kind of exegetical first aid responder arriving on the scene when you confront an interpretive problem or are trying to generally understand the New Testament. This book is, to use a medical metaphor, your exegetical paramedic, not a substitute for seeing your regular biblical physician. So he says this is not to take the place of your whatever your translation of Romans you read from. This is not to take the place of that. This is to come along and give you a different way to look at a text that's very familiar. So then there's a quick note of the abbreviations that are used in the notes, and then we're into it. And here's what the pages look like. On the left-hand page, you have each verse of the Greek text and then an English literal interlinear underneath. Now, it's not entirely literal, and this may be kind of a typesetting issue. Like, for instance, this line, it says, Paulos, a slave to the anointed Jesus, called to be a sacred emissary and consecrated for the joyous proclamation of God. I think this verb that he's translating, and consecrated, is here, and that should have been bumped down to here to line up with the English. So it's not an exact interlinear, but that's a formatting thing. And I don't know if that was anything to do with Mike or with the Lexham, whoever was typesetting, but just be aware, it doesn't line up exactly all the time. Now, if you read Greek, you're able to see, apostolos, he's translating that as a sacred emissary instead of apostle, because that's what an apostle was, a sacred emissary in the context of the church, at least. And then you can see, and then aphorismenos, this should go on the next line. Like if you read Greek, this isn't a big deal. But if you don't read Greek, you might be a little misled. So just note that. But that's what you're getting. Very woodenly literal on this page. And then on this page, you're getting his, as he said, creative paraphrase. And I'll show you some examples of just how creative he gets at times. Then at the bottom of both pages together, you have the translator notes. So like GK, this is a note about Greek. He says, Paul identifies as Christ's doulos, which denotes slave. If Paul wanted to indicate a generic servant, he would have used diakonos, which means servant, euketes, house servant, or pedos, boy servant. So he didn't use any of these other words for servant. He used doulos, the word for slave. And that's how Paul describes himself throughout his ministry, Jesus' slave. And then there's some of these notes, INT. This is interpretive notes. So that's what you have, and it's like this on every page. Now, here are some of the examples of how creative Mike gets in this paraphrase. Romans 1:15 says, for such reasons I am eager to be of service and to preach the joyful proclamation to you who are in Rome. That's kind of a woodenly literal translation of the Greek text. His paraphrase, that is why I am as eager as a puppy to make a new friend to come and preach the good news to you folks in Rome. Clearly, Paul does not use the phrase eager as a puppy. What Mike's trying to do is get across kind of the exuberance that is underneath this wording, at least how it's used elsewhere, and to present the text in a fresh way. It's similar to what Eugene Peterson tries to do with the Message. If you use the Message was never intended to be a Bible translation. It was intended, and Peterson wrote it, to be an accompanying text that you would read alongside your Bible to kind of bring out in a very, again, like Mike's doing here, in a very creative way, some aspect of the text that you may miss or that may not communicate well unless it's brought out idiomatically in modern English. Now, it is creative, and at times, Michael Bird is Australian, so there might be some Australian English idioms that aren't very common in American culture. And at other times, I think it's like he's kind of going out of his way to say it differently, to be like kind of a splash of cold water at times when you're reading, like, whoa, this is jarring. And I have a feeling that that's intentional. So for instance, famous passage, Romans 1:26 and 27, the passage about sexual relationships and God handing people over and them being inflamed by their desires for one another, women with women and men with men, and then receiving in themselves the consequence of that. Like it's a dense section. It's a controversial section in Paul, obviously in our modern culture. This is how Mike Bird translates it in this section. Verse 26, so God gave them over to their debauched desires. Their women turned away from God's plan for human sexuality and indulged in sexual acts with other women, contrary to how men and women were designed to enjoy lovemaking. So what Paul is like saying in pretty dense wording. He's spelling it out in the paraphrase. This is where it gets eyebrow raising. Verse 27, in the same way, many men turned away from God's intended pattern for sexual intimacy meant to be shared with women, and instead they got hot and horny for each other. I mean, men getting it on with other men and doing these things to themselves has such a harmful effect that the act itself proves to be its own punishment. So it's just not often you see a translation of the New Testament that uses phrase like hot and horny and getting it on with one another. Whether that's something you appreciate or not, just know that's what you're getting. And then there's a translator note in here. He also makes it clear. He says, importantly, divine wrath is said to be expressed in handing people over to commit same-sex acts, and divine wrath is not specifically located against same-sex desires. So making a difference between it's the acts, the sexual acts that are being condemned and judged, not the temptation or we would say orientation to those acts, the desire. So how that sits with you is going to very much depend on your view of what Scripture teaches about sexual ethics in general. But I just wanted to show this because this is a very clear example of the creative paraphrase aspect of this. Sometimes his paraphrase brings out historical background that if you know the world of the New Testament, you know, and if you don't know the world of the New Testament, which most readers don't, you may miss. So Romans 2:1, therefore, O man who renders verdict against everyone else, you are without defense. For in whatever matter that you condemn another, you condemn yourself for doing the same things you condemn others for. This is how he expands that in the paraphrase. That's the literal translation. Here's the paraphrase. Now, someone might like to think that this divine justice does not pertain to them. To such a person, whether a Roman moralist like Seneca, who writes ethical treatises, or even a celebrated rabbi like Shammai with an exhaustive knowledge of all things kosher, let me say this. You, O pious one, who likes to sit in judgment on others, you in fact have no excuse for your own behavior. You're a hypocritical critter. So there's a lot of assonance and sort of turns of phrase in Mike's paraphrase. I think he kind of had fun coming up with some of these. I'm guessing on that. Michael Bird, if you see this and you want to chime in and say yes or no, feel free to. But that's the feeling I get reading through this. You're a hypocritical critter who does the very things you criticize others for doing. So this paraphrase, all of this opening, like these first 4 lines are not even paraphrasing the text. It's giving the interpretive cultural background that will help inform the text. So it actually even goes beyond paraphrasing. It's sort of filling in cultural gaps. I think that's a helpful thing to do. I don't know how I feel about putting it in the paraphrase. I feel like that might be to such a degree that it should go in one of the notes, but that's an interpretive decision that each translator would have to make. But he does these, like I said, these turns of phrases. Like here, it says, but in case you haven't noticed, you are not God. So when you, a mere morsel of a mortal, the phrase, do you rob temples in Romans 2, he translates it as, if you oppose the worship of idols, do you pilfer precious trinkets from temples? Again, more assonance. And then the phrase that, if you are a transgressor of the Torah, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. He translates it literally as your circumcision has become foreskinned. And then his paraphrase is, if you violate the law's commands, then your circumcision means that you have effectively reattached your old foreskin and have made yourself like a Gentile. In chapter 3, but if our unrighteousness commends the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is not unrighteous enough so as to inflict his wrath? I'm adopting a human perspective here. May it never be. If so, how could God judge the world? So that's the literal what Paul says in the text. His paraphrase, and you can see it's very long. But for the sake of argument, if our unrighteousness, that is, our failure to be a faithful covenant partner with God, provides God with an opportunity to exercise his saving justice in delivering us, what would be wrong with that, one might say? It would mean that God has no right to get all apocalyptic on us, since our sinning is merely giving him a chance to be merciful and generous. Parentheses, it's a stupid argument, I know, but stay with me on this for a bit. So you can see expanding verse 5 and kind of giving it the emotional or the rhetorical effect that he thinks the original Greek text would have had for the first readers. And then there, like I said, Mike being Australian, I don't know if this is a more Australian or maybe possibly even a British idiom. I've never heard this as in American English, so it might be a case of that. But the phrase, all have turned away, together they become worthless, there is no one who does good, not even one. He paraphrases then, everyone has deserted God. They have become as worthless as rotten turnips. I've never heard that expression, but maybe it's one that is popular elsewhere. There are no good Samaritans. Good people are rarer than hen's teeth. Another expression I'm unfamiliar with, rarer than hen's teeth. And he actually uses this expression another time in the paraphrase. So if you're Australian or British English speakers and you're familiar with that phrase, rarer than hen's teeth, let me know in the comments, because that was a new one to me. And then the phrase, the poison of snakes is under their lips, he paraphrases, they use cobra poison for lip gloss. 15, their feet are swift to shed blood. He paraphrases, their feet run faster than a sprinter when there's a chance to drench the streets with blood. Verse 16, destruction and trouble are in their paths. Verse 16, everywhere they go is a carnival of carnage. Now, one thing that was odd to me is when it came to Romans 4, you can see here in the Greek, it uses this word or variations of it, makarios or makarioi, makarismon. And that's the word that's translated either as like blessed or fortunate or happy. And so he goes in the paraphrase in the verses 6, 7, and 8, he translates these instances of makarios as happy. So David said, and I didn't know anything about how happy a person is whom God credits righteousness. He said in a psalm, happy are those whose lawless deeds. Happy is the person for whom the Lord does not keep a record of their wrongdoing. Then inexplicably switches it to blessed. Verse 9, is this blessed state limited to those men who have circumcised the foreskin of their human flesh? But over on the literal side, he translates it each time with bless. Blessing, blessed, blessed, blessedness. So I don't know why, again, if Mike sees this and you want to let me know in the comments, I'm not sure why he switches from happy to blessed in the paraphrase, since it's the same word all the way through. Not saying it's right or wrong. Happy and blessed are both equally valid ways to translate makarios, but I noticed it when I was reading through. So the paraphrase is, again, it's intentionally creative. It's very free. It's idiosyncratic at times. For instance, Romans 5:19, which is in the paraphrase, 5:19 is here, but on the literal side, it stopped at 5:18 for some reason. And then 5:19, it's actually on the next page, but the paraphrase starts at 20. So this is a formatting error, I think, on Lexham's part, that this verse should have been put right here. Either way, though, Romans 5:19, for just as through one man's disobedience, many people were constituted as offenders, similarly through the obedience of one man, many people were constituted as righteous. The paraphrase is, for just as through the disobedience of the one man, many were lost in the everglades of evil, so through the obedience of the one, many will be declared and made righteous. So I'm not sure. I would like to know the rationale for why constituted as offenders he renders as lost in the everglades of evil. I mean, other than the assonance, everglades of evil, I'm wondering if there's something contextually about that Greek phrase that does have to do with arboreal or forest imagery or swamp imagery even. I'm not sure. And then there's sometimes where he just adds stuff rhetorically that's not anywhere in the text. Like in verse 20, it says, the Torah came to magnify the transgression, but where the offending multiplied, undeserved favor manifoldly multiplied even more. He just sticks in right before that. Whoops, sorry for the long digression. My point is, so giving kind of like what Paul is famous for run-on sentences. He's famous for long flowing sentences because he was a master Greco-Roman rhetoricist. And that's what they were known for. In English, and particularly modern English, we can't handle sentences that go too long without having to be brought back to, okay, wait, what are we talking about again? So he kind of does that in his paraphrase at this point. Now, some of his paraphrase choices remind me of Eugene Peterson, remind me of The Message. Like Eugene Peterson famously rendered the word became flesh and dwelt among us as something like God moved into the neighborhood. Well, in Romans 6, what then shall we say? Should we persist in offense so that divine favor might multiply? May it never be. That gets paraphrased as, so then what shall we conclude about this? Should we get comfortable in bad choices city so that God's unmerited kindness might have opportunity to help us? So this bad choices city is a very Message-esque paraphrase. Absolutely not. We died to wrongful things, so we cannot set up shop or buy a house there. in Bad Choices City. So this is just to give you a flavor of what you're going to find. And I'm not going to go through any more of these because part of the fun is actually reading through this and catching these very creatively paraphrased ideas. He even makes a nod at the very end where it says, I exhort you, brothers and sisters, to watch out for those who sow division and erect obstacles in your path by opposition to the teaching that you have learned. Steer clear of them. And that is paraphrased very modern social media age as, I plead with you, brothers and sisters, be alert for those who cause divisions and obstruct your progress. They've been trolling me since I was in Antioch, and they are vehemently against the pattern of discipleship you have learned. Avoid them like the plague. So I like the fact that he paraphrased it as they've been trolling me. And then one last one, when he has Romans 16:22, I, Tertius, who wrote down this letter, greet you in the Lord too. He just added this aside, I, Tertius, who inscribed this letter as Paul dictated it. Whoa, that was one epic speech he gave from his couch. Also say hi to you in the Lord. So I sat down today and read the whole thing in about an hour, give or take. I didn't read all of the translator interpreter notes, but the literal translation and his paraphrase. It took me about an hour to read through, and that's with stopping and highlighting and, thinking about it. So I wanted to show you what this is. One, because Lexham was kind enough to send this to me, and I have to mark this video according to YouTube's rules that this is a paid sponsorship. Even though they're not paying me, they just gave me this copy and it has monetary value. But for what it tries to do, number one, I think this is a great idea. In fact, this is how I do a lot of my translation when I'm teaching on a passage. I will do a very woodenly literal translation. If you watched any of our Psalms videos, that's exactly what you see on the screen. Then if I want to present it to, like, if I'm teaching it somewhere at a church or at a workshop for pastors or whatever, then I will kind of restate the text in a more colloquial way. Like I'll try to explain it like this is what he's trying to say, and I'll do it in an intentionally modern way to kind of get the idea. So you're getting the literal is important. You need to know what are the actual Greek words being used in the case of Romans, Hebrew, and Old Testament books. What are the actual Greek words being used and what do they actually mean as close as possible? But that's not a good place to stop. Then there are times where you need to bring that meaning out or say it in a way that modern audiences connect with. Now, whether or not Michael Bird succeeded in the restating it in modern language part, that is going to be up to those who are reading it. There are times where he makes theological decisions. There are times when a passage can be translated in more than one way, and he goes one way. Other translators might go another way. In instances like that, personally, I like to provide both and then let readers know why certain people go one way, why other people go another way. But that's just something that you would do more in a teaching setting or like here on YouTube in our long form videos. So for what this is, I think it does a great job. I think it does exactly what it sets out to do. I think whether you agree with how he paraphrases some things or not, you'll find it helpful, if for no other reason than to make you go back and read the text closely and go, wait a minute, how did he get from there to there? But you should be doing that with every translation if you have abilities in the original languages. And I think this would make a great little companion if you're reading and studying Romans. I don't think you should take this as the correct approach to Romans. And I think Michael Bird would be someone who would tell you that. Like he said at the beginning, this is like a first responder coming on the scene of an interpretive accident. This is not your normal physician you need to be seeing. So with that caveat and that nuance right up front, this is a resource I would be completely comfortable recommending to people. And I hope Lexham does these for the rest of the books of Scripture. So those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear yours if you come across this. Check it out. I'll put a link to where you can find this volume in the video description below. I'll also link to some of Michael's other works if you want to get more of a sense of what he is about. He's fairly active on social media. He podcasts, his YouTube channel. I'll link to those as well. You can follow him on Facebook. But hopefully this helps you in deciding whether or not this is a resource that you would be interested in. If this video was helpful, the best way to show it is by subscribing to this channel if you haven't done it already. And when you do, don't underestimate how much it helps us when you enable notifications. That communicates to YouTube. We don't just like this channel, we are actually interested in this channel. And that in turn makes YouTube want to bump us up in the algorithm and let other Bible nerds out there know about us. So that's all for now. Thanks for watching. We'll see you back here next time at Disciple Dojo. As always, keep training.